Is the Falchion actually a better armoured fighting weapon than the Mace? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now I'm going to try and keep this relatively concise for one of my videos, and this is partially, not really a response, but it's inspired by a great video by Dequitem. I'm going to link his video down below, where he basically ranked the top 10 weapons for fighting in armour. Now, before I go on, I want to state that that's a really good video, go and watch it. I don't necessarily 100% agree with everything in there, but I more or less agree. I largely agree. I probably would have put the poleaxe higher, but maybe we can talk about that in a future video. And there are also some things I would say about swords in general used in armour. I also have to say that Dequitem has more experience than me fighting in armour. Simple as that. So I actually take his opinions and his views incredibly seriously, and I give them a lot of respect, and respect where respect is due. My experience mostly absolutely is in unarmoured sparring, competition, fighting over the course of 20 odd years. So no question, my forte is unarmoured HEMA, shall we say, rather than armoured HEMA. That being said, I'm trying to change that, and I'm doing more armoured harness fecting, and some people call it armoured fighting, and intending to do more in the future. But moreover, of course, I have spent 30 years studying the sources and the source material. So what does that mean? That means I've spent that amount of time since I was at university specialising in medieval history and archaeology and looking at arms and armour, and getting my qualification in it, looking at medieval sources, what they say about these weapons, also the artwork, and studying the originals in museum. And that is really important to this, answering this point, okay? And that is because falchions in the modern world, and I have mentioned this in a recent video as well, falchions in the modern, particularly reenactment and bowhurt or HMB world, are rather different to falchions in museums. Now I'll come back to that in a second. So what is the basic question here? Well, so Dequitem and other people, I have to say, not just him, have said in the past that they consider falchions better weapons than maces. And in fact, if we look at modern bowhurt, for example, there does seem to be a preference for falchions over maces. Now, specifically, I'll only talk briefly about this because I have almost no experience of bowhurt, apart from the fact that I am friends with quite a lot of people who do it. And something which I think is interesting is in modern bowhurt, maces are usually limited to 1 kilogram, so 1,000 grams, whereas falchions are allowed to be 1,300 or 1.3 kilograms, so 1,300 grams. So actually you can have a heavier falchion than you can have a mace. And that obviously skews the results. There's other things which skew the results as well. Bowhurt is a very particular sport with specific types of armour being worn. The type of armour being worn in bowhurt is generally fairly different to actual historical armour. In some cases it's made of modern materials like titanium and things like that. But let's just leave it at that, that the armour is somewhat different, and the way it's worn is somewhat different to historical counterparts. Okay, so that's the first thing, and the weapons are different as well. And what you can do with them is different. You can't thrust in bowhurt and various other things. And for the most part you're hitting the armour a lot of the time rather than necessarily stabbing into gaps, because you can't stab. Okay, so all of that aside, we've also got to say, what am I framing this in as armoured period? So I'm not necessarily talking here about the age of mail, I'm talking about the age of plate. So I'm specifically really talking about 14th and 15th century. So what do the sources show? Let's just look at the artwork for a second. Well, actually, falchions were pretty popular. Not necessarily this type. This is a 13th century type by Paul Binns. This is a hybrid between the Conyers falchion and the Cluny falchion. We'll talk about those in a second. A 13th century type. But actually, when we get into the 15th century, we see blades more like this. They tend to be narrower and pointier. And this, of course, is based on an example in the Royal Armouries and is part of the windlass line, which I've studied the original of and took all the measurements that led to this, this replica. So when we look at medieval artwork, 14th and 15th century, we do see maces and we do see falchions. So I think it's important to state that both of them were used in armoured fighting. However, if we look at armoured duelling, which is Dequitem's main focus, and I have to say is often the main focus on this channel as well, so one-on-one combat, We actually don't see falchions featured hardly at all, and we don't see maces featured hardly at all. They are both weapons that appear in battlefield art, but they don't appear very much in treatises, barely at all in treatises used in armour, and not very much in accounts of single combat. For fighting in single combat, the primary weapons are the poleaxe, the spear, the sword, not always long sword, sometimes an arming sword, but the sword, and the dagger. And Dequitem covers that in his video very well, and I completely agree. So the primary weapons for one-on-one combat in the 14th and 15th century for armoured knights or men-at-arms, fully armoured guys in plate armour, was poleaxe or spear, then with a backup of a sword of some kind, usually a longsword or an arming sword, and a dagger, usually a rondel dagger. So those were the primary and what seems to be the most popular weapons. So where do falchion and mace come into this? Well, one of the arguments that's been made is that falchions have some advantages to them in that they've got better hand protection, they're a little bit balanced and a little bit more nimble than maces are, and they've got a small kind of point of impact because they've got an edge rather than a large surface. However, as I mentioned in the previous video, there are some problems with historical falchions. Okay, now this is a 13th century type and was clearly a type that was used predominantly in the age of mail for chopping really, really powerfully. Not necessarily chopping through mail, don't think that happened, but it would hit with quite a lot of force. But moreover, in the age of mail, a lot of soldiers on the battlefield weren't wearing very much mail or any mail at all. Some of them were wearing fabric armours such as gambesons and acatons and things like this. So I have made the argument previously that based on the statistics of these weapons, I actually think these were for mostly chopping up the low quality and low equipped soldiers on the battlefield. These weren't necessarily the sword of choice for the armoured man to fight another armoured man. And in fact, the arming sword was always more popular than the falchion. At no point in history was the falchion more common, or at no point in medieval history was the falchion more common than the arming sword. The arming sword was always the most common type of sword for all types of soldier on the battlefield, from knight to archer. The falchion was preferred by some people for some specific purpose, but we don't really know what it was. Now, note the shape of this large, wide, chopping 13th century falchion. Now, go to another relative of the falchion, this from the 15th century. Look at this langmesser, which, if it had a pommel on the end, we'd call a falchion. This is a completely different type of blade. It's almost like a large carving knife, basically. Okay, and then now go to this other type of blade here, an English falchion of the mid to late 15th century. Completely different blade again, narrower, but actually thicker and with a reinforced point. Now, this is a really important point. Okay. There's a big change in falchions here. Not all falchions are equal. These are clearly big choppy things, not very good for thrusting, useless for thrusting through mail. You are never ever in the world going to be able to push that point through the mailed armpit of a opponent. This, however, completely different kettle of fish. So while this is a falchion and this doesn't have anything like the chopping capacity of that Conyers type blade, this thrusting blade does, much like an arming sword or a longsword of the period, have the type of tip which is able to possibly puncture through mail or find other gaps between plates. So absolutely, this is a product of its time. This is a light cut and thrust sword, essentially like a little sabre, that can be used for stabbing into mail gaps and into eye slits and stuff like this. This is not. Completely different types of falchion. But there is something that all of these, if you consider these at opposite ends of the spectrum, the pointy stabby falchion and the big choppy boy falchion, they do have something in common, and that is they are light. Okay, every historical falchion that I have looked at in a museum, or I have got the measurements of because one of my friends has taken photographs and measurements of it in a museum, is thin and light. These are not big, heavy. These aren't estocks. These aren't crowbars. These aren't maces. These are very, very different to maces. So we must not make the comparison between a falchion and a mace because they're utterly different. They are much more fragile. and they are much thinner at the edge. Now, let's just talk about the thinness of the edge there. If, as I said before, if you are smashing something like this blade using period 13th, 14th, 15th century steel into a hard piece of steel armour, you are going to fracture, chip, bend or break your blade relatively soon, okay, using period. And we know this happened, it's mentioned in written sources and it's shown in historical artwork. So one of the big problems we've got is we've got a data point looking at modern reenactment weapons, which are blunt and in some cases overweight, in the case of most Bohurt falchions. If we look at a Bohurt falchion of 1.3 kilograms that has a thick, blunt blade, it is going to survive smashing into armour repeatedly and be a very effective weapon because it has adopted the characteristics of the mace. So what you've got is you've made a sword-shaped mace. So in that case, you're really looking at the qualities, in my opinions, of a bar, what in the Maciejowski Bible or Morgan Bible, for example, would be a bar mace. Okay, so absolutely, if you make a falchion which handles like and weighs like and balances like a mace, it's going to hit like a mace and it's going to also survive like a mace. But that's not what historical falchions usually are like. I'm not saying that 1.3 kilograms is necessarily a crazy weight. I'm not saying they're crazy overweight or anything like that. But these are thin, flexible, very thin-edged blades. Clearly, they were not intended, even if they were sometimes used like this, they weren't intended to just be smashed into helmets as hard as possible every time, because the blades wouldn't survive using period steel. Now, again, this is in no way criticising Dequetin because he makes some fantastic points. He makes a really good point that I have to say I'd only vaguely thought of before, but it's a really good point, and that is that you could, if you're hitting a softly armoured or non-armoured opponent, use your thin edge to chop limbs off. If you're hitting an armoured opponent, you could flip this around and hit with the blunt back edge. Now, this is really interesting, and I think he's absolutely right. I think this was probably done, and it's one of the advantages of a single-edged sword is you've got the ability to hit someone with the blunt back for a percussive effect that won't chip your edge in the way that if you hit with the sharp edge it would. Moreover, I suspect this was probably done because we sometimes see falchions where the edge is not on the edge, the sharp edge is not on the edge that we would expect it to be. And I suspect that this came about originally because someone realised that, hold on, I'm hitting with this side, that works quite well, or I'm hitting them with this side, that works quite well because of the angles of the blade. I want my edge to be on the other side. So I think that's quite likely. Anyway, that's a tangent for another time. But fundamentally, the falchions in museums, I mean, the original of this is about 800 grams, if I remember correctly, if you imagine it had a handle on it, because the original's handle missing. This is really, really light, okay? This is a light, probably Archer or Billman's sidearm, okay? Super, super light. The Conyers falchion is probably at the upper end of the spectrum, but even this is not very heavy. It's about, I think it's about 11 or 1200 grams, and yes, it's balanced quite far from the hand, but it's a pretty light and quick sword with a very thin blade. It has to be very thin to have that breadth and not be horribly overweight. And when we look at things like Landmesser or various other types of falchion that are around in the 14th and 15th century, they also tend to have thin, light and quick blades. They are not designed primarily for armoured fighting. However, I'll caveat that point with the fact that some of them do have these reinforced points, and as Dequetin says, you could absolutely half sword with any sword. You can half sword with a katana, you can half sword with a rapier, it's shown in rapier text, you can half sword obviously with a long sword everyone knows about, or an arming sword, and yes, you can half sword with a falchion. But bear in mind, half swording into someone's mailed armpit or into their visor slit is only worth doing if you have a point which is capable of getting through the mail. There's no point half-swording with a Conyers falchion because it ain't going to go through any mail and it's not going to get through any visor slit because the end is too big. Okay, so you've got to have a relatively small and pointy and hopefully reinforced tip that will actually have some effect. Now, coming back to maces. So, fundamentally, you know, fighting in armour, which is better out of mace and falchion, it's really down to personal choice. You've got a different set of options with the falchion as you have with the mace. But what I would say is that when we're making that comparison, don't think about massive striking force of these falchions because they don't have massive striking force. They're about the same as an arming sword, okay? And even something like the Conyers falchion blade, yeah, it has more than an arming sword, but it is not a historically made one with a thin edge and the correct weight and everything, is not comparable with a mace. Okay, so final thing to say is, I think when we're making these comparisons between weapons, we've got to remember there are differences in how we use them in a recreational or a bowhurt way or a reenactment way or a HEMA way. There are differences in how we use them. We're never really stabbing through mail. So just because I've successfully half-sworded into someone's armpit doesn't mean that my sword point is actually going to go through the mail in their armpit. Mail works, okay, mail armour works, and they put mail in their armpits and the inside of their elbows and the back of their legs and all this kind of stuff because it works. So just because I am able to plant my point into some part of the opponent doesn't mean I've wounded them, okay? That's the first thing. So I think that sometimes we get a skewed idea of the effectiveness of swords and spears and even poleaxes in armoured recreational fighting, because we're not actually stabbing through armour. We're not actually stabbing into mail with a sharp point. We're not verifying that that stab would have done anything. Whereas when you just hit someone in the helmet with a mace, you more or less see what the effect of the hit in the helmet with the mace was, because you're not doing anything different to what you do with the real mace, which is hitting them in the helmet with a mace. So finally, I'd just sum up by saying, out of falchion and mace for armoured fighting, my opinion currently is that the mace overall is a more effective weapon for armoured fighting against another armoured opponent in a duel, one-on-one, than the falchion is. I think the falchion is better against lighter armoured people because you've got a long, sharp edge and a point, and you're more able to more quickly and for longer without getting tired deal with a lot of opponents and take them out if they've got lots of exposed, you know, if they don't have armour on their legs or their arms or their face, then you've got more openings and more places to easily put them out of action with this than you do with the mace. And as Dequitum says, I agree, your primary target with the mace is the head. We even see that in Native American warfare with tomahawks. The head is the main target. But in terms of simplicity, you don't have any edge alignment, you can strike all around. All you're really doing is smashing and bashing, and you're able to sort of basically use less expertise, I think, with a mace, and that was always my argument in the first place, with the mace than you are with the falchion. But also, if we just use historical evidence, it does seem that maces and other forms of bludgeoning instrument, like warhammers, were more popular for armoured fighters fighting other armoured fighters than falchions were. But, so I think on that basis the mace probably edges it over the falchion. But let's remember that all of these fall by the wayside compared to poleaxes, halberds, two-handed maces, long swords, arming swords, rondel daggers, spears, even glaives, partisans. These sorts of weapons seem to have been more popular, so therefore I think we can probably say they were more successful. And really, in the 14th and 15th century, we have to reiterate that the armoured knight's weapons of choice for fighting another armoured knight one-on-one are the poleaxe, the spear, the longsword or arming sword, and the rondel dagger. The falchion and the mace seem to have been more battlefield weapons and occupied a different space, and as some of the commentators under our videos have noted, it seems in some cases the mace was a backup to the sword in case the sword broke, which is a very interesting detail, and people shouldn't underestimate the importance of the S-stock, and that's probably something we'll come to in a later video. And in this context, an S-stock is essentially a specialised thick and thrusting, usually long sword, but can be an arming sword, but essentially a specifically thrusting, dedicated, stiff long sword, which increases your chances of being able to get through that mail at the armpits or anywhere else, which, as I say, I think some thinner bladed swords might struggle some of the time to get through good quality mail, well-made mail, and we shouldn't always assume that a thrust in an armpit would have the effect that we hope it would do. Anyway, I hope that's been thought-provoking. Remember to check out Dequitum's video down below. It's really cool, and also it relates to this video very strongly. Maybe there's some other things from that video which I think we can probably talk about in the future as well. But thanks to Dequitum for that video. Thanks for watching. give us a like. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.